This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit. What do you guys want to talk about?
Oh, how nice it is. Getting back to the regular Monday format. And what a roundtable discussion we have on tap today. Actually, it's not really anything all that special. Not trying to give your hopes up or anything. No, what we do have, though, is a solid recounting of some of the weekend pro wrestling I watched. Some of it was good. Some of it was great. And the rest of it was Friday Night SmackDown. No, actually, there were a couple good things on SmackDown, so I don't want to sell it short. I will give you two guesses as to what those good things were. Spoiler, it involved the Bloodline. Even Retro Raw had a nice rare gem this week in history. We'll talk about that shortly. But obviously, if you're checking out the FSWR show for the first time, you can find us on Rumble and YouTube every Monday and Friday for new uploads. I have not done channel plugs in a while. As always, your support is always greatly appreciated. Subscribe, comment, like the show, and all the stuff that makes small channels like this flourish. I've been at this for a solid 2 years now, I believe. Can't remember what the first show we reviewed on the channel was. Might have been SummerSlam in like 2021. I mean, I've been at this since 2019, but, during the whole scamdemic period, I just kind of got fed up and took a break because of how rotten the products were. Worse than they are today. Imagine that. Since then, things have been relatively steady. Peaks and valleys for sure, but at least the shows are lively. I had about all I could take with those cinematic matches. Watching Bray Wyatt get burnt alive, or seeing Alexa Bliss puke up black tar. That was the boiling point for me. Now, we've still seen our fair share of stupid stuff, but it's been downgraded since all that pre-tape junk took place over the last couple years. Thank God for small favors. But even so, a lot of that stuff, I still might take that over Retro Raw from 1994. So, are we approaching the end of the Raw library yet? How many more seasons do we have left to go? I think last I checked, there were some 22 seasons of Raw. If you calculate all the years they've been on the air. We are in Season 2. If only I had expectations to make it that far. To cover every single solitary Raw from 1993 up to whatever year this is, 2023. I think I'll be long dead by that point. I don't see myself doing this well into my 50s. But you never know. So anyway, this was actually a pretty interesting Raw. Mostly in that the show was mainly built around one thing. That was the Bret versus 1-2-3 Kid title match. But we also had a special play-by-play commentator for this program. The return/rehiring of Jim Ross. After he had previously been let go from the WWF after having suffered his first of multiple Bell's palsy attacks. I believe his first firing was back in January of this year. But seeing as how Vince is currently out of commission dealing with the steroid trials, they kind of hired Jim back under the radar and brought him in as a play-by-play guy for the remainder of the summer. Because I know Jim was eventually let go again later on once Vince came back. That relationship was always very sketchy. Now, of course, they brought him back later on, and there was a whole thing in '96 where he was a heel on television for a while, and yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll cover that all down the road. It wasn't pleasant, from what I remember. But Jim was here with the Macho Man to call the show, replacing Gorilla Monsoon, who I think was more than happy to finally give up the seat. That guy was phoning it in from the moment they put him in the booth with Savage. I mean, he was watching the product along with everybody else and thinking the quiet part out loud. Boy, is the show rotten. Couldn't agree more. But the thing about JR is that he had a lot more vigor at this point, and he was an all-around better announcer than Gorilla was. Having already done commentary on Mid-South and Smoky Mountain for a period of time, he was already comfortable in that main speaking role. And even with the health issues, he was a big ball of energy for the entire program. And overall, he did a phenomenal job with Savage. It's just one of those unfortunate business dealings where Jim was always dealt the short end of the stick in the WWF. Problems with management, him and Vince not seeing eye to eye on a lot of things, having the tough dealings with the health problems. It was a rough road for him. But I think over time, once Vince understood the natural gift that JR had for the business, that working relationship kind of panned out better in the long haul. Once they worked under the same roof and came to understand each other. But we'll be seeing more of JR in the weeks to come, so we will enjoy it while we can. And like I said, this show is primarily built around Bret and Waltman for the WWF title. Total babyface match. But I think it's one that the hardcores would appreciate over the casual fans more, especially for the time. I already talked about how I had no memory of this match ever happening, but that also might have to do with the fact that it was just a random title match in the middle of Raw in 1994 when you had all the other horrible crap going on at the time. It's hard to get it to stand out. Plus, I was like 7 or 8 at the time, so my memory wasn't as clear. But watching this match again with fresh eyes, I think I understand why older fans have such fond memories of it happening. It was basically like watching the Stampede wrestling match from the late 70s or early 80s in the middle of the cartoon era of the WWF. In other words, professional wrestling in the middle of a sports entertainment program. I mean, it was definitely the match that put Sean Waltman on the map as a major player. The whole scrappy underdog resiliency story they'd been building up with him for the last year, that actually had a payoff in the end. And when you really think about it, I think it's worth mentioning for younger fans out there that may not understand ring psychology the same way that us older fans do. Babyface matches in wrestling are hard matches to book. You have to have the right scenario with the right guys in front of the right crowd to pull it off. There are a lot of nuances that go into these kinds of matches. And it's a shame that we've come so far in the business now where promoters and bookers will just randomly do these kinds of matches freely and expect people to care. There is a reason that traditionally heel versus heel or face versus face matches, they were kind of rarities. You didn't see them as often because it's really hard to get the fans to pick and choose sides in a lot of those situations. The good thing with a match like this and the fact that it worked was because, yes, there was a sportsmanlike respect they established before the opening bell. Both guys didn't really have a grudge against each other going in. But at the same time, the kind of performer Bret was. He's hard-hitting, he's intense, and whether he's wrestling the top heel in the company or an underneath babyface, he's not going to modify his ring style all that much. He's going to work the same Bret Hart type match no matter what the case is. And again, this is coming from a guy that was never the biggest Bret Hart fan growing up, but only when I started to get older did I really understand what truly made Bret special as a talent. His promos always sucked, but like the pro wrestler version of Bret, that took me a long time to come full circle and understand what made him so unique. And again, this is still a relatively young green Sean Waltman. He hadn't been in the business all that long before they put him in this position. And while it never really went anywhere for him in the WWF, I mean, he was mostly relegated back to mid-card shortly thereafter. But the fact that they were even willing to go there with him at this time kind of shows how much respect they had for him as a worker. In the land of the giants. And here we are in 1994. Sean Waltman, the 1-2-3 Kid. He's getting a featured title match on their flagship program against their top babyface in prime time. That's not something to overlook, especially if you know the history of how Vince promotes wrestling. Now, in terms of how they laid out the match, I like the story they told. They end up leading to a false finish midway through where Bret gets the pin, but Sean's foot was on the bottom rope, and Bret made it clear to Hebner that he didn't want to win that way. So they waved off the call and they continued the match after their second break. And even as the match continued, it's not really a circumstance where there's a designated heat spot because, the crowd's doing the split chants. We have the dual 1-2-3 Kid chants and Go Bret Go chants. Bret working over Waltman for a lot of it, which kind of made it easier for the fans to cheer him on. But Bret wasn't exactly working heel either. They'd give Sean a few hope spots here and there. Bret would cut him off and keep the pressure applied. I like the story they played up where Bret would keep going for near falls, but every time Waltman would kick out, Bret would show just a little bit more frustration. Again, the match wasn't about establishing Waltman as a main event guy per se, but having him go toe-to-toe with their world champion and giving him a run for his money, that was enough to put him on the map. And this is where I go back to recognizing Jim Ross's commentary and putting over how great he was. He was the exact kind of play-by-play guy they needed to call this match. I don't think Gorilla Monsoon would have had the same effect. They needed a guy like JR in this spot. Every time Kid got a break, JR was right there to put over how big of an opportunity it is for him. He has so much energy, talking about how Kid's on the brink of a major career accomplishment. He was exciting. He was energetic. It was so great. You really look back at earlier Jim Ross on commentary and you're like, you wish we had play-by-play guys like this in today's business. Kevin Kelly, he's good for what he's designed to do on that Collision show, but I mean, even he can't hold a candle to what JR was doing back in the day. And Sean's comeback at the end was fantastic, throwing all those high spots at Bret. The crowd's reacting to everything as such. They milked a lot of those near falls at the end when Bret was in jeopardy. And it finally built to a climax where Sean gave Bret the press slam off the top rope. He went for one last-ditch effort for a high spot, goes up for the missile drop kick, but Bret catches the legs, picks him out of the air, immediately applies the sharpshooter for the quick tap out. And of course, there's Savage and JR immediately giving both guys a standing ovation afterwards. JR's talking about how it's one of the greatest wrestling matches he's ever called. And he probably wasn't exaggerating. JR's called a lot of good matches in his storied career, but at this time, that was probably one of the better wrestling matches he was able to call live. It was by far the best match we've ever seen on Retro Raw, at least to date. Probably ended up being one of the better matches in the entire year of 1994. Maybe take out the Bret matches with Owen at WrestleMania and SummerSlam, but the competition wasn't all that high. But I definitely see why this match has a special place for a lot of older fans that remember WWF from this period. It was a rare gem, a diamond in the rough, in the middle of what was arguably one of the worst periods in WWF history. Here's Bret in the 1-2-3 Kid putting on a wrestling clinic and showing that professional wrestling can still be done on a cartoon sports entertainment program, surrounded by nothing but goofy comedy characters. Now, is this the best match of either guy's career? For Bret, certainly it's not. For Shawn? I mean, it is one of the better singles matches he's ever had. He probably had some hidden gems at later points in his career. I remember him and Chris Jericho had a pay-per-view match in WCW in the late 90s that I thought was really damn good. I mean, Lord knows I could ever remember what pay-per-view that was from, but it was right when Waltman jumped ship and joined the NWO. And then I think a couple months after that, he and Eddie Guerrero had a match that people raved about at the time. It's always a sad thing about the 1-2-3 Kid's career. Like, you remember a lot of the stuff he was involved in, whether it was the NWO stuff or the DX stuff later on in the 90s. But I think the problem is that he was always just sort of a guy in the pack. He was always kind of the awkward fourth wheel behind Hogan and Hall and Nash. Then he was the awkward fifth wheel behind guys like Shawn Michaels and Triple H and Billy Gunn and Road Dogg. I mean, he even got overshadowed by Chyna at various points. It's just one of those things. He was a very gifted athlete. Probably even underrated for his time. But because of the level of star power he was surrounded by at the time, he just never really grew beyond a certain point. He was factored into big things, but he was never the guy. Wrong place, wrong time, I guess. But he certainly stood out here. I mean, they'd been better off just making this a 60-minute Iron Man match, because nothing else on the show is going to come close to following this. And I know that seems shocking to think, Crush versus a very green, pasty Matt Hardy with no physique or muscle tone. Yeah, that match was not as good as Bret versus the 1-2-3 Kid. And to think, the balls these people had. Somebody thought, hey, you know what would be a great match to follow that opener? After Bret and Shawn tore the house down for 20 minutes? Let's follow that with a Crush squash match. Fuck you. That's all I have to say. I didn't even know Crush was still around at this period. I thought he had gotten let go from the company and he came back later in 95, but nope. He's still around. Still collecting a paycheck, doing God knows what. The only thing of note here was that while Crush was beating up Hardy the entire time, Savage, apparently still wired up from the previous match, kept shouting, "Goal!" to the top of his lungs. And he did not just do this after one offensive move from Crush. He did it every time. It was funny the first time. By round 7, it got quickly infuriating. And then after Crush won, the announcers briefly touched on an All-American Wrestling segment where Todd Pettingill was talking with Ted DiBiase, apparently about the company trying to hire a company detective to figure out the ongoing story with the imposter Undertaker gimmick. Because the internet wasn't big enough in 1994 to handle the detective work. I have nothing else to add. Much like how I haven't had much to comment for the entire career of Bryan Adams. He was big, he was lousy, and no matter how hard I tried, couldn't get away from that motherfucker. Bored the brakes off of me for years. Then we followed that with Razor Ramon versus Barry Horowitz, which was mildly more interesting than the Crush match. Savage was still trying to guess who the mystery investigator was going to be to uncover the Undertaker story. He mentioned Sherlock Holmes, Dick Tracy, and Larry Spinks as possibilities. And I think JR had enough of the Macho Man's bullshit at this point and just gave up trying to humor him. Probably wishing he was sitting next to Boyd Pierce. Meanwhile in the ring, Razor did some stuff to Horowitz and then cradled him with a small package and won. I was convinced at this point Savage was either high as fuck or he was just outright tapping out trying to call the rest of the show, knowing good and well that nothing else was going to be able to top the Bret Waltman match from the opener. So by all accounts, I don't blame him. I'll tell you what was almost as good as the Bret Waltman opener was the King's Court segment with Lawler and DiBiase. Oh, what a duo. My, how I wish I could have gotten to see these two as a top heel tag team at some point when they were in their prime. Can you imagine the promo work? Just in this 2-minute segment alone, it was some of the best interaction between two heels I've seen in the entire history of Retro Raw. They're just playing so well off one another. Lawler's getting the scoop on the status of the $1 Million Corporation. They're running down all the guys in the faction who are locked under contract, up to and including Lex Luger, who we have been told has not exactly signed a contract yet, but DiBiase made him an offer that he cannot refuse. And they're just yucking it up like two conniving heat magnets, laughing at all the peons out there. God, this is so great. You know what wasn't great? The TV main event this week. IRS versus Ray Hudson. This was where I was convinced they just gave up trying. I'm watching a Raw main event featuring Erwin R. Shyster. Talk about throwing up the white flag. Meanwhile, the announcers are still goofing off, speculating on who the mystery detective is going to be to uncover the DiBiase Taker story. In giant bold letters, I wrote the following: "Fuck off with that shit." Meanwhile, Savage plugged a bunch of upcoming USA shows. JR tried to correct him on a few mispronunciations. Savage told him to go pound sand. And then IRS won with a penalty while the crowd sat on their hands and could not care less. That was pretty much everything I wrote down. Now, luckily, that wasn't the final thing on the show. We had a quick follow-up with Bret. And, obviously he's putting over the match with Waltman from earlier and talking about how he gave him a run for his money. But as Savage asked him about the current situation with Owen, and the fact that Owen's making it abundantly clear that he wants the title shot next against Bret, Bret is here to assure everybody that Owen's win at WrestleMania was a lucky fluke. And now that Owen's got Jim Neidhart backing him, Bret's going to need to bring in somebody to even the odds. Somebody in the Hart family, perhaps. And he thinks he knows the right man for the job. At which point I jokingly wrote down Teddy Hart. But, maybe that joke's a little too soon. Anyway, not much of the promo. Like I said, Bret's babyface promos were always the shits. So I just try to find the redeeming qualities where I can. The Bret Owen feud is still heating up ahead of SummerSlam. That is their main draw right now. Everything else is just kind of there to fill out the card, including the whole Undertaker storyline, which is... I mean, it's atrocious, but we're not even in the thick of it yet. They still got that Luger carrot dangling over everybody, too, trying to figure out whether or not Luger's going to join up with DiBiase's crew of goons. It's, it's something. Luger was dead in the water by this point, but even at the time, it kind of looked like they were trying to salvage his career somehow. Never went anywhere, unfortunately, but at least they were trying to keep him in featured spots. Meanwhile, I guess next week we're going to have Diesel versus Luger for the IC title. Let me repeat that. Diesel, a.k.a. Kevin Nash, versus Lex Luger. Buckle up for that one, folks. That incoming train wreck will be quite the sight. And with that, now we have to switch gears and talk about this episode of SmackDown from Friday night. Dude. And you know, I even took a short nap on Saturday afternoon right before I sat down to watch this show. I was like, maybe it'll put me in a better mood if I just close my eyes for 20 minutes, watch the show after I rest my brain, and try to go into it fresh. Well, I can tell you, I was in a good mood before I sat down to watch it. Afterwards, the story wasn't so much the same. I figured maybe a week off would have gotten the stain off. Give me a chance to recuperate and forget about some of the awful stuff I've been forced to sit through on this show every week. Then I was reminded of all that again. And then I reminded myself why I fast forward through a lot of this show. Take out the Bloodline stuff and the occasional LA Knight match, who by the way was not on this show. God, is it abysmal. I mean, it's still not as painfully horrible as Dynamite is most weeks, but Jesus Christ. I thought the nap beforehand would have helped. God forbid I actually try to stay awake through the first 45 minutes of this thing. I still nearly dozed off midway through. And the funny thing is, they started it with the Bloodline. And I've got to admit, if there's one thing that I was not expecting them to do after we saw the Bloodline Civil War fallout from Money in the Bank, that being the fact that we saw Roman get pinned for the first time in 3.5 years by Cousin Jimmy. Or no, it wasn't Jimmy, it was Jay that pinned him. Well, anyway, if you would have asked, okay, Tommy, what do you think their big story follow-up will be this Friday? Well, I surely never would have guessed this. Whatever on God's green earth they called this thing, a tribal court for Roman Reigns sketch. That one was definitely out of left field. Oh boy. Where to start? Is that ever the ultimate question? Well, first off, let me start with this. By the time this was all over, I think I figured out why I was on the precipice of falling asleep before hour 1 ended. Out come the Usos to start, and they're just peachier than pigs in shit over what happened this past weekend. They got the big W over Roman. Things are looking up. They're like the biggest baby faces on the entire show. So, they get approximately 3 words out before getting cut off by wise man Paul Heyman and Solo. And they come out. And they're walking. And Heyman's talking. And they're walking some more. Heyman's doing the long, drawn-out promo where it sounds like you're listening to his dialogue at half speed on YouTube. And they eventually get to the part where the Usos finally tell Heyman to shut up. In very scripted fashion, I should add. So Heyman basically tells him to piss off. Says there's only one person that can demand him to stop talking. And I think he was trying to set up Roman as the punchline. But instead, Solo cups the microphone with his hand. And he grabs it. And he slowly walks over to the other side of the ring. And he just dumps the microphone out to the floor. And well, it gets ominously quiet in the room. Everyone's just standing there in complete silence. And they're standing there. And they're standing there. And they're standing there. Time passes. The Earth goes through about 23 or 24 axis rotations. Meanwhile, I am screaming at my TV monitor. Keep in mind, this is like 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday when people are out and about. I am yelling, fucking do something. Jesus H. Christ, it's a 2-on-1 advantage for the Usos. Jimmy and Jay are standing right there. They could just kick Solo in the fucking jaw and be done with it. Move on. Paul E ain't gonna do anything. That fucking plump walrus can barely waddle to the ring without gassing himself out, much less punching back. But no, the Usos just stand there with their teeth in their mouth. And then finally Roman's music cues. And Roman's walking. And he's walking. And he's walking. And the Usos continue to stand there stoically. And they're watching him. And finally, after literally 8 minutes of fucking nothing, guess what these Nimrods do? Yup. They go to commercial. I wrote down in big bold letters, fuck this show sucks, and I think I would rather go back to watching Retro Raw again, because at least something happened within the first 10 minutes of that program. Bret Hart versus the 1-2-3 Kid. That was at least exciting. Even though the rest of the show was horrid beyond all hope. I'll go back and watch that show 27 times before I ever think twice about rewatching this. 8 minutes! We have had nothing but VTRs, ring entrances, and people literally standing around doing nothing. Breathing. Blinking. That is all that has happened. And it gets better. Because we come back, Roman's standing there in the ring with everybody. He has his back turned to the Usos, who have now migrated into the other corner. And they're standing there. And they're standing there. And they're standing there. I began sweating profusely. My fists were clenched. I could literally see the whites on my knuckles forming. I'm about to punch a hole through the wall. And right as I'm about to have my second conniption in the span of the first 15 minutes of this garbage television program, when you know it, finally, shit starts happening. First, Roman's trying to call BS on the whole concept of this court hearing, saying that he didn't order this, none of it should be happening. But then Jimmy and Jay tell Roman that he's not calling the shots this time around. Now, they have footage. At which point, they proceed to show us Exhibit A, and it's basically just pre-taped footage of Roman acting like a dick to the Bloodline over the last year, being a glory hog. At which point, and this was actually probably the funniest part of the entire segment, I don't know if this was intended to be comedy. They were an MSG for this show, so, you had a lot of smart fans out there doing the weird chants. But all of a sudden, the crowd began chanting, "You fucked up," at Roman. And of all the comeback lines for Roman to think of, not telling the fans to shut their mouths or acknowledge how great he is, he just looks around and goes, "No, I didn't." And again, I don't think that was supposed to be funny, but I just started laughing to myself when Roman said that. It might have been the inflection with the way he said it. He sounded so earnest. Like a kid that got busted with his hands in the cookie jar. "Roman, you stole a cookie before dinner." "No, I didn't." Anyway, so, Roman's going into a diatribe about how he did it for The Rock. No, I'm just joshing. No, he says he did it for the Bloodline because he was forced to. He was forced to be an asshole because he's been carrying everybody on his back since the moment the group was formed. Says that he does not need this job because he's got 5 kids of his own. His daughters are watching in the back right now, seeing Roman as the enemy of the world because the Usos want to go into business for themselves and compile all this makeshift footage to try and make him out to be the bad guy. I don't know. There was something in here about him saying that he doesn't need the money. He could basically retire now and spend the rest of his life on beaches. And he finally tells Jay that if he wants to be the tribal chief so bad, well, he can have it. Roman says, I'm done. At which point, he takes off the lei necklace and puts it around Jay's neck. And he goes down on one knee to make it look like he's about to acknowledge him as the new tribal chief. A passing of the torch, what have you. And of course, I'm just sitting there waiting to see how long it takes before Roman finally cock blocks him because, everybody knew a swerve was coming. Sure enough, Jay lets his guard down, like an idiot, and Roman goes to pound town on the Samoan gonads, at which point, we were now 20 minutes into the show. So I thought, all right, fine, whatever. Took way too long to get to the point, but the payoff was at least good. Oh, but no. There's more. There's much, much more. In fact, let me read for you bullet point by bullet point everything that transpired from now until the end of the segment. Jay goes down in a heap selling. Jimmy goes after Roman in the corner. Solo goes after Jimmy. Solo ends up standing in the middle of all 3 guys. The necklace is now laying in the middle of the ring for Solo to pick up. So now the fans are chanting, "Put it on," trying to get Solo to pick and choose sides now. Then Roman gets up and walks over to Solo, and they're milking that whole angle of Solo hesitating to hand over the gimmick. That goes on for about 9 months. And then Jay attacks Roman and Solo. And then they all wind up fighting out to the floor. We are now 25 minutes into this segment. And the heels are beating on the baby faces outside. And they're beating on them. And they're beating on them. And they're beating on them. Eventually, Solo's got Jay tied up in the ring ropes while Roman's beating up Jimmy. And I get what they were going for with the angle here. Restraining the babyface so he has to helplessly watch his partner get beat up. I think the problem here was that Jay was not selling it particularly well. He wasn't really reacting or showing any kind of emotion. He was just looking on like, shit, dude. My brother's really taking an ass whooping over there. The crowd is kind of eerily quiet for a lot of this. Finally, Jay breaks free, and he goes after Solo and Roman until he then gets cut off and laid out like a geek. Finally, after literally a half hour from start to finish, the payoff is Solo putting Jimmy through the announce table. Jay was somewhere. I think he was buried under the rubble. And of course, they come back from break showing Jimmy get carted off into the ambulance. They got, Boyd Pierce and a bunch of the locker room baby faces there. Sorry, what the fuck did I just say? Did I say Boyd Pierce? Adam Pierce. Jesus Christ. Been watching too many of my mid-style tapes in my free time. But it's hard to break this down. There were a lot of good things that happened here. The angle was well thought out. But god damn did it take forever to get to the point. By the time they came back from commercial and showed the ambulance footage, they also aired a replay of the entire segment again. The highlights, obviously, but by the time that was all over and they were ready to move on with the rest of the show, we were basically 40-something minutes into this thing. That's a fucking long time to be dedicating to one segment. Now, granted, it's the Bloodline, and that story is usually the only thing worth giving a crap about most weeks. So, if they were going to stretch something out, this is probably the story to do it with. But they could have cut this down by like half the time, and it would have accomplished virtually the same thing. All that dead air time in the first 10 minutes where everybody was just standing around doing nothing. Took a long time to get to the actual good stuff here, and that's probably my major gripe with it. Like, they got to the good shit at the end, but man, they were really milking the build-up. Almost a little too much. But what's done is done. Jay's hurt. Jimmy's dead. He got carted off to a local medical facility, so now we just wait to see how Jay follows up. Spoiler, we didn't have to wait all that long. We got our answer by the end of the program. Oh, and by the way, while it's on my mind, regarding that hour-long brawl with the Bloodline where they're just out there fighting endlessly, it's a small nitpick, but I have to bring it up. Where the fuck was ring security? How is it that Roman and Solo are out there beating the shit out of the Usos for like 10 minutes and nobody ever comes out to help? There's no cops, there's no officials, no security, no underneath baby faces. Where was everybody? Were they all clocked out for dinner? That was also mildly irritating. But then, our first official TV match of the program, again, 40 minutes into the show just about, it's Sheamus versus Austin Theory for the United States Championship. And in typical WWE fashion, they wrestle for 1 minute. Sheamus does a big shoulder block attack onto the floor. And they go to commercial. I was fuming at this point. Been waiting over a half hour to see some fucking wrestling on this program. Finally, we get a match. And it goes 60 seconds to a break. And they come back. They do some more stuff for a while. It's all right. Crowd's sort of lukewarm for a lot of the action. I can't tell if that was fatigue coming off the Bloodline stuff in the opener or if the MSG crowd just really didn't care about the match. Considering Sheamus was involved, I mean, I honestly can't blame them if they weren't all that interested. So, they're doing the match. They come back from second commercial with Sheamus in the driver's seat. Sheamus ends up countering one of Theory's roll-through moves and gets him in the cloverleaf. And then who should come out to join the party but the Suspect Sissies, better known to some as Pretty Deadly. Right, because that's what the show desperately needed at this point to bring some energy into the room. Was Pretty Deadly. So, of course, Sheamus lays them out like geeks, because that's essentially what they are. Theory hits the A-Town down for a 2 count. I think this was where Butch and Holland ran out and started brawling with the gay jobbers. And in one of the more uncreative WWE finishes I've seen in quite a while, Sheamus is setting up for the bro kick. And for whatever reason, the brown-haired sissy makes his way up to the ring apron. So like a fucking moron, Sheamus gives him the brogue, and then Theory just stacks up Sheamus by his trunks and wins. I couldn't believe it. What a fucking goofball that Sheamus turned out to be here. He had the option to kick Theory in the face and pin him to become the new US champ, or he could kick the guy who wasn't involved in the match and was already dazed hanging out on the ring apron. So Sheamus picked the Pretty Deadly guy. This was dumb. And even worse, I had completely forgotten that Austin Theory was on this show. That is how frivolous he's been since they drafted him to SmackDown. You know, I always talk about how the Bloodline is the sole highlight of the program virtually every week, plus the occasional LA Knight match whenever they don't job him out like a dweeb. I had completely forgot about Austin Theory. Have they done jack shit with this guy since he got drafted? I can't remember one thing of note he's done. He is the United States champion. This guy has a belt. And he is literally just another guy on the program right now. I mean, he wasn't on Money in the Bank, I know that for a fact. But let's be frank, the guy was more relevant when he was carrying around the briefcase. Like, have they just given up on the Theory thing? Is that what I'm seeing? Or do they seriously have no idea what to do with him? Aside from affiliating him with the epitome of Death TV and Pretty Deadly. Because that'll get him over, right? Yeah, have him hang out with the guys that wear women's clothing in all their TV segments. That's a surefire way to make him stand out like a man. Give me a break. Speaking of them having no idea what to do with guys, Grayson Waller. Okay. Seriously. What am I missing? I really want to know. I am genuinely fascinated by this. What is this company's fixation with this guy? Why does he get to have multiple talk show segments every week with top names when he's a literal nobody? He's a generic-looking dude that you couldn't pick out of a police lineup. And they've had this guy interact with John Cena and now Edge in less than a 7-day window. Doing back and forth promos. Like he's the fucking Rock or something. I don't get it. His promos are boring as shit. He's not over. The people do not care about him. His accent is off-putting. They can't find anything constructive for Austin Theory or LA Knight to do, but they'll book Grayson fucking Waller in featured segments with Hall of Famers to do promos like he's actually somebody that matters. How does that happen? Think about that. Up until this show, the guy never wrestled a main roster match. That wasn't until he started running his mouth on Edge, and then we saw where that led later on. So Edge is doing the babyface promo to the MSG fans. He's talking about his first appearance in MSG for the WWF back at SummerSlam 98, when he was the mystery partner in a mixed tag match with Edge and Sable versus Jacqueline and Mark Marrow. Why don't I remember that match? I have no memory of that ever happening. Was that really how they debuted Edge into the WWF? Good God. The Attitude Era. It's not as great as we remember it being. Now, of course, now that I think about it, I've tried to block off so much of the Attitude Era from memory. Maybe I shouldn't be all that shocked. I also try to block out a lot of the stuff I ever saw from Sable. If only she could match her level of charisma to the size of her fake tits, she'd have been the biggest female star of all time. Turns out plastic surgery only gets you so far when you have the personality of fucking drywall. Anyway, so long story short, Edge thanked the fans. Grayson tried to stir up shit and tease everybody with a fake Edge retirement speech. And then Edge informed Grayson that he's actually here to wrestle tonight. And he's going to be his opponent. Cool. I mean, at least the Grayson Waller talk segment here actually led to something. Most of his segments never go anywhere, but they were at least smart enough to use this to set up something for later on. At least they're doing more with him than they are with Karrion Kross at this point. Oh my God, this poor guy. Here's everything you need to know about this next match. It's Karrion Kross versus AJ Styles. The match goes 90 seconds. Scarlett tried to interfere by pulling at AJ's leg. Mia Yim cut her off and threw her into the barricade. And then AJ broke out of a fireman's carry, hit Kross with a phenomenal forearm, and pinned him. Dude. I mean, at one point, I'd have called it a burial treatment with what they've been doing with Kross. I think we're beyond that threshold now. They should have just had AJ bend down and piss in his mouth while he was laying there. I've already talked about the hair thing with Kross not doing him any favors with the general look. It also kind of looks like he's giving up trying with his body in a lot of ways. He's pale. He's out of shape. He's just totally lost at sea right now. I don't even know what to say at this point. I think they've about run their course with that experiment. The best case scenario for Kross is to send him away for 6 to 8 months and bring him back when he's tan, bald, and actually looks motivated. I don't know what this guy did to piss off management, but whatever it was, they're not letting up. It's sad, dude. Depressing is what I wrote down in my notes. It was just depressing. Not as depressing as the next women's segment. This was just flat out bad. And it was rushed all to hell. I don't even know why they bothered. Here's basically everything that happened. I'm just going to read my notes verbatim. Girls brawled. Io teased to cash in. It was a fake out. People stood around. I have no idea what's going on. Who is mad at who? And why is Charlotte dressed like a giant mackerel? This all went 2 minutes. And it sucked. And then we had the Edge and Grayson Waller match. My first viewing of Waller's ring work since the days of NXT 2.0. And even so, I wouldn't be able to recall a single match I ever saw from him down there. Maybe a squash or two, but it wasn't memorable. So, this was my chance to see what all the hype's about. Obviously, they see something in the guy. This is a big match to debut him on for the main roster. Putting him out there with a star like Edge. They must really see superstar potential in the guy. And after watching him here, nah. I mean, he did fine. He wasn't horrible. His ring gear sucks. And he doesn't have a particularly great physique. His basics are okay. He seemed to do all right with timing. He was in the right places at the right times. His selling was okay. But I guess that's what I'm hung up on right now, that one talking point. He's fine. He's okay. But am I seeing superstar written on him like I am with a guy like Theory or Solo or LA Knight? Guys that ooze charisma and show actual top star potential? Not really. I mean, I see more top potential in a guy like Cameron Grimes than I do Grayson Waller. Where the hell's that guy been? Wasn't Grimes working TV squashes with Corbin a few weeks ago and beating him in like 10 seconds? What happened with that? Did they just pull the plug and forget about him? I want to see more of Cameron Grimes than I do Grayson Waller. And of course, right as I'm thinking all this to myself, what's the big deal with the guy? Why is this company so high on him? Well, sure enough, The finish is Edge hitting a spear and pinning him clean. So I guess we're calling him Grayson Fodder then? And what the fuck was that spot that led up to the spear? Did I hear Michael Cole say that was his setup to the rolling stunner? Excuse me? His finishing move is a 50-yard dash from the aisleway into the ring where he flips through the bottom rope, springs up to his feet, just to hit a fucking cutter? What? Well, in that case, thank God Edge speared him. Because the next time I see Grayson actually hit that move effectively and win, I'll be the first to call bullshit on it. I haven't even seen the move yet, and I already know it's going to be dumb. I mean, the match was whatever. Edge carried the whole thing by and large. Again, Waller did everything he was supposed to do, but, was this some groundbreaking performance that won me over? No. Not even close. I don't see what the big deal is with the guy. And I don't think my opinion is going to change on that. But, then again, if you want to make the argument, this company needs to figure out a way to build up some new stars somehow. So even if he may not be my cup of tea, maybe he shows promise to management. And if he's somebody they know is going to be loyal to the company and they can put stock in, sure, give it a try. They certainly try to run with worse options as top guys. See Jinder Mahal. But in any case, we now come full circle on this program. Yeah, by the way, that Edge Grayson Waller match, that was their main event match. But, as we know, the only thing that matters on the show is the Bloodline. We started with them at the top of the program. Now we're here to close things out. Roman Reigns' larynx be damned. Whether or not his voice is completely or halfway shot, he's going to go out there and cut his motherfucking promo on Jey Uso, and he's going to finish what he started. Now, we were told that Jey was back at the building, and now he is on the hunt for Roman and Solo. Where did he go? Did he go to the hospital? Maybe I missed that during that ambulance angle. I didn't see him jump into the back of the truck, but maybe he did. Anyway, we certainly didn't need to wait long for the response. Here comes Jey through the crowd. He jumps Solo over the barricade. He grabs a chair at ringside and goes after Roman. I think he got one clean shot in before Solo tried to intervene and pull the chair away. And that's when Jey just turned around and went to town on poor Solo here. Chair shot after chair shot after chair shot after chair shot to the back. Looked brutal. And it's times like this where I actually wish WWE would allow work chair shots to the head, just so you can actually milk the gravity of some of these storylines. Jey hitting Solo with one lethal blow to the head and knocking him out versus 17 chair shots to the back. It does make a difference. But in any case, Jey got on the microphone and he told Roman that he is the judge, the jury, and the executioner in this trial. And now he wants Roman to accept his challenge to a one-on-one match so he can whoop that ass. So I guess there's your SummerSlam program. I mean, the people popped for Jey at the end, so definitely worked. Obviously, the next step in the conversation is to figure out how they go about booking a finish. But I think we'll save that topic for a different date. It was a great close to the show. In terms of everything else, I mean, what do you really say? It's the Bloodline show surrounded by all the other peripheral stuff that just kind of fills out the remainder of the program. I wish they would have cut back on like 10 to 15 minutes of that opening Bloodline segment where everybody was just standing there stalling. Maybe you could have made more room for that Karrion Kross match. What they did with the Bloodline material was great to advance the story. Setting up Jay as the next challenger, that's not all that surprising. Jimmy being factored into the angle. Roman's performance was fantastic. Solo was great. Paulie was Paulie. They're all phenomenal. It's just the recurring issue that continues to be an overcasting cloud with a lot of this show. Once you remove the Bloodline from the conversation, what are you left with? You're left with Pretty Deadly, the Brawling Brutes, and Grayson fucking Waller. And whatever the girls are doing most of the time. I mean, a lot of it I tune out anyway. But that's kind of sad when you think about it. You got the A+ material carrying the load, and then you got D- material filling the space in between. And it really weighs the show down when you know that you're never going to get anything remotely close to following the Bloodline stuff in terms of intrigue. It's why the show is so lifeless a lot of the time. Once we got through that opening segment and they went back to the ring for the US title match, I was already drifting off to sleep by the time they rang the opening bell. Because it's all so predictable. You know what's going to happen. They're going to wrestle for a minute, then they're going to go to break, then they're going to come back and do some stuff until somebody evidently runs out and interferes, and then there's going to be some overbooked bullshit finish that just kills the crowd. We see it almost every time. Or in the case of the Edge-Waller match, they'll book a flat finish that just kind of takes the piss out of the room. I don't know. I mean, on the bright side, I was happy the women didn't dominate this show for a change. That was kind of refreshing. Not seeing the girls get pounded down my throats for the entirety of the 2 hours. At least it was mostly male-dominated, like wrestling's always been and always should be. And I know that'll piss off all the shimmer marks out there, but if you don't like it, bite me. But we'll see what the follow-up is with Roman and Jay next time. Hopefully we get a medical update on Jimmy's condition. And we continue to count our blessings that the announcers are actually permitted to say hospital and ambulance on TV again. Once we start hearing them say local medical facility and vehicular transportation mobile, that's when you know we're all screwed. Tell you what show's not screwed, however, is this AEW Collision show. At least not right now. But God. You want to talk about the ultimate yin and yang of all elite wrestling right now. Look no further than the comparison between Dynamite and Collision. Good Lord. On the Wednesday show, everything's being run and operated by monkeys. Then on Saturday, you got actual grown professionals at the wheel. And it makes all the difference in the world. And I'll say it again. The show's not perfect. But at this stage, as a fan, given the nature of what I've been fed as a wrestling fan for the last 15 to 20 years, especially with a lot of this modern crap I watch, I'll take professionalism above anything else. Yeah, I'll probably see my fair share of sloppy matches and promo segments that don't always blow the roof off. But with AEW Collision, they're trying. And that's definitely a vast improvement over what I'm used to seeing with the Cucamonga cockfighting stuff on the other station. I mean, they're giving me reasons to care about things. They're actually trying to make matches and segments meaningful. We're being given context for why things are happening. Like I said, the execution may not always be perfect, but the effort's there. And I value that. Even things as simple as with the way they open the program this week. They want to get off to a hot start, so here comes CM Punk in street clothes. No big grand entrance, no pomp and circumstance. He's booked for the main event with Samoa Joe later on, the semifinal round in the Owen Hart tournament. So he comes out and puts over the importance of the match, talks about the importance of the tournament and what it means to everybody that's associated with it. You know, he says, Without Owens' influence in the business, a lot of the AEW locker room would cease to exist, including Punk. And when it comes to the match with Joe, he can't guarantee victory. But what he can guarantee is that he's going to leave it all in the squared circle. He talks about how he's never beaten Joe, and then many say he's the one guy in Punk's storied career that he can never beat. The one guy that has his number. It's great. I now have a reason to care about the outcome and repercussions of the match because it's not just generic tournament match with no story or context. Joe and Punk have a history. You know, when we saw a little bit of that explained in the following promo package, that was well done. Again, the shit does not have to be that difficult. It's two guys having a grudge match to try and settle a rivalry from an 18-year-old puzzle that Punk is yet to solve. Can he finally finish the Samoa Joe problem? Can he finally beat the one guy that's given him a run for his money every time they fought in the last 18 years? It was an excellent start to the show. And like I said, the video package for the Joe Punk feud was great. Joe's a phenomenal promo. That can never be overstated. It's crazy looking at old tapes of Joe from back in the day, though, man. I mean, he never had a small frame, but you even look at some of those old mid-2000s tapes from him, and even back then, he still had some muscular tone to his physique. He was a lot leaner back then. I remember even for the first couple of years I watched him in TNA, he was a lot leaner. I mean, he only really started to balloon up around the early 2010s when he just completely gave up trying. And of course, when you're working with Russo all those years, that stress will do a number on you. So anyway, we eventually got to our first match on the program. It's Powerhouse Hobbs versus Ricky Starks in the first of the semifinal rounds in the Owen Hart tournament. And again, I can't put over enough how good it is to actually see these guys get featured segments on TV regularly. You know, how many times have I sat here on the channel in the last 2 years and said, Powerhouse Hobbs is great. Wish we got to see more of him. Or, Ricky's great. Wish we got to see more of him. Now that they're not battling for airtime on the Wednesday night Wild Wild West, we actually see them in featured capacities again. And now we know what we've been missing out on all this time. It's not to say either guy is the second coming of Ric Flair or Steve Austin, but Jesus Christ. In today's business, I'll take Hobbs and Starks any day of the week over the fucking Job Order, the Elite, or the BCC. You know, when it comes to Starks and Hobbs, these are also two guys that have history together. And I still think they did him a disservice here by not going into extensive detail about their past. You know, they showed a quick highlights of their work as a tag team. Never showed the actual breakup or anything that led up to it. So the only thing we really had to hang our hat on was Nigel saying they used to be good friends, but that was a long, long time ago. To which I then said, they broke up like a year ago. It really hasn't been that long. They just did such a piss-poor job following up with the story between these guys, and everyone pretty much forgot about it. So when it comes to the actual match, there were basically two big anchors that weighed it down. The first was the fact that Hobbs is still very green. And when you think about the match he had last week with Dustin, where he had the older, experienced ring veteran in there that could help guide Hobbs along and make sure he was in the right spots at the right times. As much as I love Ricky Starks, he's probably not what you would call a great ring general just yet. Because Starks is a young guy himself. How old is he? Like, early 30s? I mean, he's only been doing this for a short window, too. He's farther along than Hobbs is, I think. But in general, I wouldn't say this was a very fluid match. Yeah, there were some choppy spots here and there. A little bit of miscommunication at points where it looked like both guys weren't entirely on the same page with where they were supposed to go with the next spot. And you're going to get that with younger guys. It's usually not a big deal. But this is where having agents and experienced veterans is extremely useful, because sometimes you need those guys to lay out matches and give pointers. The ones that have been doing this for a long time. Maybe the guys wrestling on Collision will be more open to listen to it, since most of the guys wrestling on this show are the ones that actually want to get better. So they'll be eager to take the advice, unlike those empty-headed dipshits on the other channel. The other big issue here, and I've talked about this before, I'm not going to go too into detail about it. The QT Marshall stuff. It's bad. We all know it's bad. The involvement in Hobbs' segments are always detriments. They've seemed to cut back on a lot of the bad QTV skits they were doing that were just hokey and awful beyond all reproach. But them being out there the entire time, all you're doing is waiting for them to get involved somehow. And sure enough, Hobbs and Starks are doing their match. For the most part, it's mostly inoffensive. Like I said, there's some choppy parts as the match kept going. The most obvious botch here was during the last minute or so when Starks completely fucked up that tornado DDT off the ropes. He just, for whatever reason, couldn't get his footing, and then instead of maybe having Hobbs improvise and try to cut Starks off to save it, instead they try to do the move anyway, and it just looked horrible. Both guys looked like they nearly killed themselves. But that eventually led to Starks getting tripped up trying to hit the ropes. So while Aubrey was arguing with QT on the apron, Hobbs had a visual pin on Ricky after hitting him with a spine buster, which seemed a little weird to me. Why was QT on the apron arguing with Aubrey when his own guy had the pinfall on Ricky? Instead of him standing there like a dipshit, flailing his arms going, Aubrey, Hobbs is trying to get the pin on Starks. Count the fall. Turn around. Or, how about you just drop down from the apron, you dumb fuck? That way Aubrey could turn around and count the pin. I didn't like the overbooking of the finish, but Starks ended up going over with the spear. Then they do a long dramatic angle afterwards where Hobbs is standing there having a meltdown and teasing that he was going to get into it with QT and beat the crap out of him. He ended up killing Aaron Solo, which was fine. But I wrote down, thank God at least they're finally teasing the breakup. Hopefully they don't prolong it much more, because I don't think I need 7 more weeks of having to see QT Marshall drag Hobbs through the mud. The quicker Hobbs removes himself from this group of juggernauts, the better. And that includes the overacting blonde chick with the 14 different accents. Where did they find her? God, is she horrible. Anyway, moving on. Miro denounced God again. That was the thing. And I've got to admit, this was probably around the point in the show where we hit a major lull for a period of time. We had some abysmal acting with the girls in the back that was so wretched I couldn't even watch it. Something with Athena and Willow Nightingale. I couldn't even stomach it enough to care to write anything down. That was then followed with a hype package for Blood and Guts this Wednesday, which I had completely wiped from memory until just now. I said, fucking shit. I have to watch that, don't I? Well, I really don't, but, figuring that's going to be about 45 minutes of the program anyway. May as well. And who knows, maybe it'll be so ungodly horrible I can get some sick enjoyment out of it. I already know what to expect out of guys like Moxley and Omega and the Beta Bucks. Now I think it's just a matter of seeing if I wind up laughing at the incoming stupidity. Will we get the exploding boot of doom again? That's the pending question. Or will Moxley bleed? As if. Tell you what I wasn't laughing at was this Julia Hart match with whoever this chick was. I wrote down, chunky blonde girl that I've never seen or heard of before. And to be frank, she wasn't even the problem. Here's the thing. When it comes to Julia Hart, she has many upsides. She's incredibly hot. She's youthful. She's great at being the stoic, eerie goth girl that stands around looking menacing. The one thing she's never excelled at, though, is wrestling. So naturally, what does AEW do? Well, they put her in the ring to wrestle. And it went just as you would expect it would. It was bad. And look, I'll just go back to my commentary that I made on the Dynamite Report. When it comes to the whole girls wrestling thing in AEW, I know that Tony Khan thinks he's obligated to appeal to the market that wants to see women's wrestling. I mean, whatever minuscule subset of that overall fan base it might be anyway. The point is, it continues to weigh this show down every time they book a girls' match. The only place that I want to see Julia Hart is out on the floor looking pretty. I don't need to see her having sloppy indie-level matches on national cable TV. God love her for trying, but she's better off just standing on the floor and not wrestling at all. That's just my opinion on it. If you don't like it, tough shit. The other thing I don't like is seeing Andrade cut incomprehensible promos in the back where it sounds like he's gargling with marbles the entire time. This has also turned the channel heat on every level. And Andrade, to my recollection, is supposed to be a babyface now. In fact, just about everything with the House of Drek on this show just needs to fuck off and go away forever, because I forgot that he's still feuding with them. Again, this is the kind of shit that belongs on Dynamite. And quite frankly, I don't care what the working relationship is between Malachi Black and the EVPs. Apparently that's gone south lately, which accounts for why we primarily seen the HOB on Collision instead of Dynamite. You know, Malachi apparently doesn't like working with the Beta Bucks and Kenny either. Glad to see he's finally seen the light. But that doesn't excuse the fact that this spooky sports entertainment bullshit belongs on Dynamite. And if Malachi doesn't want to work with the EVPs on the other channel, well, there's always Rampage. The point is, get this crap off Collision because it's killing the show. It fucking sucks. This is worse than the shit they were doing with Raven and the Flock on Nitro in like 97 or 98. It's garbage. Absolute garbage. Get rid of it. You know what wasn't garbage, though? Was this FTR versus Juice Robinson Jay White match. Good to see a bare-bones traditional FTR tag match again. Holy cow, when's the last time that was a thing in AEW? We've seen him in plenty of 6-mans and 8-mans recently. It's been so long since we've seen a Cash and Dax regular tag match on this show. I'd totally forgotten those guys were even the AEW Tag Team Champions. Which actually got me rethinking my whole take on that blind eliminator tournament they're doing. Because if we end up getting an FTR versus MJF Adam Cole match out of it, that actually might not be that bad. For the time being, though, it looks like FTR will be dealing with Juicy Fruit and Jay White in the interim. This was apparently another one of those tournament eliminator gimmick ordeals. You know, Jay and Juice beat FTR. They get a title match out of it down the road. I still have no idea why these things are even called tournament eliminators. But then again, I don't know why Tony Khan does half the stuff he does when it comes to booking, so just best to forget about it. Anyway, this match. Holy shit. A lot of stuff happened here. That is for sure. Yeah, remember when I was saying how unfortunate it is that we only see FTR wrestle maybe like 3 times on this show in a given year? Oh, now I think I know why the Beta Bucks have tried to actively bury their momentum at every turn. Because FTR, yeah, those guys are really talented. It's one of those things where, you see Dax and Cash wrestle a regular tag match and you're reminded, oh yeah, AEW actually has a legit top tag team, despite the lackluster division. It's a Major League A+ sports team surrounded by a bunch of minor league D-listers. And that's not to devalue or take the piss out of Juice or Jay, because they were equally as great in this match. I always say it takes two to tango, and they held their own. But this is certainly the kind of tag team wrestling I prefer over that trampoline flippy floppy bullshit I get on the other channel most weeks. I mean, this match flew by so fast, I didn't even realize it went damn near a half hour from bell to bell. I mean, I knew it was a long match, but it certainly didn't feel that way. And again, man, it's the professionalism that stands out above anything else on this show. They're not goofing off. They're not trying to do 18 different comedy angles. They're being serious. They're making it look like a legit struggle. They're making it look like 4 grown adult men fighting to see who the better team is. And yeah, it was non-title, so, you can definitely argue that they threw so much in this match. I mean, you may as well have just made it for the fucking belts. And there's something to be said about that for sure. But I love the ebb and flow to this. They took their time with things. They didn't rush into spots or go 100 miles an hour from the jump. Dax and Cash are hitting hard from the beginning and doing some great double team spots with Juice and Jay. I like the do-si-do double German suplex spot right before their first break. They come back with the heels managing to cut off the champs and take control. Juice and Jay are working like heels. No one was burying the referee at any point. Cash was great at selling as they're milking the hot tag spot to Dax. And they stayed on that well through the second break spot. Because right before they cut away, they do a deal where Cash finally broke free from the heels and he's going to crawl over to make the tag to Dax, but Dax is busy feeding for Juice on the apron, so, they didn't even get to the hot tag spot until they came back from commercial. I think Jay knocked Dax into the barricade and then dumped Cash out to the floor from the other side, and that was their break spot. So they come back, and, that's when they kick things into a higher gear with Dax getting in there to run wild. At this point, the crowd energy in the room is picked up because now it's time for the babyface flurry. FTR's in control, a lot of back and forth spots as we're building up the intensity of things. And granted, I'll concede, there were some quirky things going on during the 4-way breakdown spots. Everyone was definitely running on fumes by the time we got to the 20-minute mark or so. The spot where Dax suplexed Juice right on top of Jay's face and nearly killed him. God, fucking hell. And Jay looked a little woozy for a while there. I don't know if anyone else picked up on that, but he looked like he got knocked loopy because he was a bit rattled for a period of time there. And there were some miscues around the last few minutes where all 4 guys are in there doing some back and forth counters. I don't think everybody was entirely clear on where they were supposed to be in position for some of those spots. Like the deal where FTR were going for the big rig on Jay and then they just sort of let go and then, Juice ran in to try to do something. Some of it didn't work. Got a little cluttered in there for a while. And there were long stretches during the last few minutes where Paul Turner was just kind of letting everybody run wild with free reign. Not really enforcing the 5-count rule with the illegal partners. Again, I bury that shit on the other channel, so I'm going to call it the task when I see it here. I see it so often these days, it's just second nature at this point, but, I kind of hope they would pay special attention to it on this show. But in terms of the finish, you had Jay and Dax going back and forth. I think Nigel called it a good old-fashioned slobber knocker, to coin a once legendary quote. And when Dax went to hoist Jay up for the atomic drop, Jay blind tags in Juice so Juice can run in, plant Dax with a cool-looking front-face DDT, and to the surprise of a lot of people, he goes for the cover, 1, 2, 3. Cash tries to run in there and break it up at the last minute, but he's not able to get there in time. So the photo finish doesn't really work for FTR there. Great tag match. A lot of great stuff there. Probably one of the better tag matches you'll see in AEW all year. If you just simply account for the standard 2-on-2 match and not those artificially contrived trios matches. And I've got to say, man, between that 6-man tag that kickstarted the pilot episode, followed by that great 8-man tag the next week, which I thought was better than the 6-man, now you throw FTR versus Juice and Jay in there after the fact. These have all been strong contenders to make the list for top matches of 2023. Probably wouldn't fall into like the top 5 or top 10. But, these matches have all happened in rapid fire succession. And they've all involved the same guys, more or less. Juice and Jay have made heavy strides on this Collision show, man. They're really standing out. They weren't really doing much for me on Dynamite for the longest time. Mainly in that I don't think we ever really saw them booked or used all that effectively. But since they've jumped over to Collision and they've been two of the more heavily focused guys on the roster, it's served them well. They're a very good tag team. I've enjoyed their work with Punk and FTR in the last several weeks alone. And it's funny, too, because, I saw these guys in New Japan for years. I always liked Jay White. I always thought he was a very strong singles guy. To be honest with you, though, Juice, out of all the stuff I've ever seen from him in New Japan, I just was never really sold on him. But over here in the States, it's weird. He fits in so much better in the American market. I don't know how that works, but some guys translate a lot better in different territories. It's kind of the nature of the business. But yeah, they've been phenomenal in their roles. And they're going to get a tag match out of this, or a tag title match out of this, so I'm interested to see how they fare in the rematch. Probably seems a little rushed to be going right into the 2 out of 3 falls, especially when that match is apparently going to be happening next week. Good Lord, do you think you could hotshot that anymore? But that's apparently what they're doing. They set that up a couple segments later. 2 out of 3 falls the next week on Collision. All right, then. But yeah, I enjoyed this. Very much so. And even prior to watching the Joe Punk match, I was like, damn. They're really not leaving Punk and Joe with much margin for error. The bar's been set pretty high after this showdown. I don't know how Joe and Punk are supposed to follow it. Moreover, I don't know how Scorpio Sky was supposed to follow that. Poor guy. His big triumphant TV return to the ring after months of inaction, and he has to somehow try and follow that barn burner. Well, this wasn't quite as good as the FTR match, but Scorpio versus Action Audrey, it was all right. Fine little enhancement match to put over Scorpio in his big comeback. The only gripe I had was the fact that they let it run through a commercial break. Did we really need that? I get Scorpio's been away for a while, so I obviously wouldn't expect him to go out there and squash Audrey in 40 seconds. But I think if the goal is to get over Scorpio again with the AEW crowd, probably shouldn't be having competitive matches with underneath guys. Gotta be honest, I don't think this is the most effective way of getting Scorpio reacquainted with the crowd. He went over with the TKO. It was okay. But what do you do with him? I think that's the biggest question. When he did that promo last week, he basically just said that he's coming back for a fresh start. What does that really mean? They're going to try to elevate him back to the TNT Championship level? Are they just going to have him meander around as a mid-card guy? I think that's been the biggest problem with Scorpio Sky's booking in AEW since they broke him away from Chris Daniels and Kazarian. Whatever that little trio thing they were doing a few years ago was. But when they broke up that team, Scorpio never really stood out on his own. I remember they were doing the thing with him and Sammy where they were flip-flopping the TNT title back and forth for a while, and that got old real quick. And then there was the thing with Dan Lambert that was just death TV on every level. And most of the time, Scorpio was just standing in the background. I'm kind of wondering, what does a singles run or lone or Scorpio Sky have to offer at this point? That's where I'm sort of befuddled with it. And they got Ethan Page hanging around, so who knows? Maybe they try to go back to the well with them as a tag team again. Just take out all the Dan Lambert stuff and let them just be a mid-level babyface tag team for a while. See where that goes. Or, you can always switch them heel if you need somebody to face FTR. Lord knows they need fucking tag teams in this company. Especially ones we can take seriously. Speaking of such, anyone want to account for Mike Bennett and Matt Taven? Just saying. But now we circle back to the ultimate question. Did Joe and Punk top the FTR Juicy and Jay match from earlier? The competition was high. And they certainly gave it their all. It's Punk and Joe in the semifinals of the Owen Hart tournament. We know Ricky's waiting on deck for the opportunity to face the winner next week in the finals. So by all accounts, they were really going out of their way to make it seem like Joe kind of had this one in the bag. So I got to be honest with you. When they booked Punk to go over in the finish, I was genuinely surprised. I did not see that finish coming. I was going through so many twists and turns in my head trying to come up with all these multifaceted ideas of how they get to Joe versus Starks in the finals. What creative booking decisions do they go with to get to that point? How do they put Joe over Punk without taking the piss out of the room? Little did I ever stop to think. Or maybe they just have Punk beat Joe straight up and do Punk versus Starks in the finals. Mind-blowing. Never would have thought of that. Sometimes it's the simplest outcomes that you overlook. In any case, Joe versus Punk. Again, we know the history. They've enlightened us. We know what these guys are capable of doing in the ring, even at their more advanced ages. They're not spring chickens anymore, but they also have been around the block, so they know how to lay out a competent professional wrestling match. This was pretty much everything I expected it to be, plus a little more. I really enjoyed this. I haven't seen those old Joe Punk matches in a long time. I don't know how well they would stack up by today's comparisons because of how much the business has changed. I would probably find more value in them than a lot of younger fans today. But even so, Joe versus Punk here in AEW, it still felt major league. You believed in everything they did. Joe was the monster heel. Punk was the sympathetic underdog babyface. They relied on a lot of ground and pound moves and kicks and strikes, which plays well for their move arsenal. They laid into everything they did. Everything Joe does, man, he always delivers it with such intensity. When he's in there chopping Punk down to size or giving him those quick jabs in the corner, you can see Joe's making deliberate contact with those work punches, but goddamn do they look brutal. And as the match progresses, Punk is able to start firing back on Joe. They're doing very basic rudimentary stuff. Not doing 450 splashes or inverted falcon arrows off fucking ladders through shards of ass glass. But lo and behold, the people give a shit. They're into it. They did great with getting people to care about the near falls. Whenever Joe had Punk temporarily isolated with trying to lock in the coquina clutch, the people popped. And even when Punk went for the GTS on several occasions, he never hit it. But Joe was always right there to keep the attack going on him. They did a nice long crossface hold. They had Punk fight out of a muscle buster in the corner, which set that up perfectly for Punk to do the tornado DDT. And right as he goes for the GTS the final time, boom, boom, a couple more counters. Joe couldn't lock in the coquina clutch again, so Punk countered with a roll through and got the flash upset pin. 1, 2, 3. Joe sold it great. The announcers are putting over the genuine shock of it. It wasn't Punk necessarily winning in decisive fashion, but Punk just caught Joe off guard and outsmarted him in the end. That was the story. And that worked perfectly for what they did in the post-match angle where Joe kind of lures Punk into a false sense of security by, going in and thinking he's about to let bygones be bygones. So he goes to stick out the hand. They temporarily embrace with the handshake, but Joe pulls Punk in and then puts him in the coquina clutch. Out goes Punk like a light almost immediately. Joe's there screaming, "I've always been better than you." That was great. I laughed at that. Joe's such an awesome heat magnet. And of course, FTR come limping down to make the save as Joe teases he's going to grab the chair and try to take out Punk again. And of course, they're still beat up from the tag match, so they're not going to get too physically involved. They're just going to be there to eat the bullet if Joe were to go crazy. And they actually had an interesting little angle here to close things out where Starks comes out there to stare down Punk, but then he just kind of turns around and walks away. There's no confrontation, but, he wasn't looking to come down and get involved in any way. Almost like he's selling the confliction. Because technically it is face versus face next week. Punk and Starks in the finals. Should be a great match. But it's one of those who do you cheer for scenarios where you're going to wind up splitting the crowd. And at the same time, you also have the Joe story lurking about. Wondering how he's going to factor into things. So that's a great cliffhanger. Is he going to get involved? Is he going to fuck over Punk? Could be. And while it wasn't the outcome I expected, it worked. It absolutely worked. I have no complaints with that swerve. In general, looking back at the show, we got 2 stellar TV matches out of this one. And while overall I wouldn't say I was in love with this show, it definitely left us with more to talk about than the previous week. I know they kind of got killed in the ratings last week, which is rather unfortunate because I thought last week was a pretty good show. There wasn't anything standout on it, but, in terms of going back to grassroots pro wrestling, the stuff that Punk promised a few weeks back during that return promo, they went back to it. And it was good. This show, while it definitely had some clunkers on it, mainly the Julia Hart match, that tag match in the main event made up for it in spades. And here's the thing, too. What I like about the show right now is that I'm actually seeing tiers of star power. You got your Punks, you got your FTRs, you got your Ricky Starks, you got your Jay Whites and your Juicy Fruits at the top of the pecking order, your Samoa Joes. Then you got your middle card guys that are coming up the ranks, the Powerhouse Hobbs, the Miros, the Scorpio Skies of the world. And then you have your underneath talents to fill out the rest of the card. And while it's not all my cup of tea per se in terms of who's getting featured, I gotta be honest, it stands out more to me here than it does on Dynamite, where every time I watch that show, man, I just see guys. I don't see tiers. I don't see hierarchies up and down the card. Everybody's booked to be on an even playing field. Everybody's on the same level over there. And it kind of makes it hard to care a lot of the time because when everybody's presented as an equal between the alleged main event guys and the underneath guys, nobody stands out. When I'm watching Kenny Omega sell for Flat Wheel Yuta for 15 minutes, and Omega's supposed to be one of their top guys on that show, it makes it impossible to care. When I watch Collision, I don't see that. I see variety. And that's what I want. Again, the show's not perfect. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't really know how a lot of this fits into the pay-per-view models or the big events that AEW plans on running down the road, especially later in the summer. Collision's kind of in a weird state right now where it feels like it's on its own island entirely, separate from everything else going on. How do any of these guys factor into the Wembley show in August? Or the All Out pay-per-view that's apparently happening the week after? I completely forgot about that. These are kinds of things that I would get concerned about, though. Like I said, they're already hot-shotting the 2 out of 3 Falls match with FTR, Juice, and Jay next weekend. They still have room to do Joe and Punk again, but I think that's going to heavily rely on stipulations now that we've actually seen the match on free TV. They have plenty of talent right now to build up feuds and rivalries, but it seems like a lot of that stuff is getting blown off on the Collision shows right now. Not a lot is being saved for pay-per-view. It's just something to think about as we approach late August. Is there anything on this show that's being saved for pay-per-view? Or is that going to be another clash of styles when they have to have the EVPs and Punk under the same roof again? I mean, they managed it for the Forbidden Door pay-per-view. But how long does that trend continue before things blow up again? How long before everybody starts arguing over who should get the main event spot? Or whose matches draw more? As long as that albatross is hanging over this company's neck, this Collision Dynamite roster split is only going to be so much of a solution. Just more bang for your buck. Can't believe I said that. I retract that statement. Fuck the Bucks. Anyway, so we're rounding this one out. Nice little normal weekend of pro wrestling discussion. How about that? It all works out in the end, doesn't it? So we're back on Friday for the classic review of Crockett TV and World Class, and whatever awaits us with Blood and Guts. I almost sort of wanted to forget that was happening entirely, but now they needed to remind me of it on this Collision show, unfortunately. Like I said, I expect that to be at least a full hour of content right there, so hopefully I won't have too much to talk about with that show. I mean, it's AEW's version of War Games. I've seen the match a couple times now. Last year, I don't remember being all that impressed. It kind of looks like, based on what they're doing this year, a lot of that same talent's going to be involved. I'm actually kind of curious for a second here. Who was in last year's Blood and Guts match? Do they even have their own separate wiki page? Yeah, I guess they do. Here it is. Yeah, that show apparently happened on June 29th of last year. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, here, runtime for it was 46 minutes and 45 seconds. We had Eddie Kingston, Santana Ortiz, and the Blackpool Combat Club of John Moxley, Wheeler Yuta, and Claudio Castagnoli with William Regal. Oh, yeah, that's right. They wrestled the Jag-Off Asshole Society with Chris Jericho, Jake Hager, Sammy Guevara, Daniel Garcia, Matt Mini, Dick Menard, and Angelo Puff Parker with Ty Conti. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a similar cast of characters. The BCC are involved. Good God. Can you believe that faction has existed for over an entire year? Has there ever been a more useless faction than that group of fucking clowns? Not to my recollection. So yeah. And then we have this year's Blood and Guts, which is basically just the Elite versus the BCC. So you have Mox, Claudio, and Yuta in there again, and I guess Takeshi is going to be involved. And they're also facing Omega, Page, the Beta Bucks, and apparently there are going to be 2 mystery partners on opposing teams. Oh yeah, that's right. Danielson's hurt right now, so he can't even wrestle. Oh my God. So who's the big mystery guy going to be? Fucking Ibushi? I hope not. Who even knows? I don't know. It's got to be Kingston for the babyface team, right? No, wait, the babyface team is the Elite. Right? Oh, I don't fucking know. Who cares? Why am I talking about this right now? No one cares. All right. So we'll be back Friday to review that Calamity. And I'll catch you guys all on the flip side. Take care. Peace out.